We're good.
All right. Well, with that, let's go ahead. And as Bronwyn said, this is Act One of a two-part play. And my subtitle here is To Freeze or Not to Freeze. That is the question. Because these will be the two major ways that our friends, the caterpillars, not only the caterpillars, but so many other insects that live here in the DMV and in temperate zones have to face the immitigable season that we're in right now. And boy, it sure has been a chilly winter. I've had a lot of questions on things like, are we going to see fewer mosquitoes this year? Well, maybe not so much. But certainly there will be some things that do take a beat down with all this cold weather we've had. It's going to be a better year for things like harlequin bugs. This is primarily a pest that comes up from the south. And hey, guess what? Once we start to hit single digits, bye bye harlequin bug. Same thing for the kudzu bug, an important invasive pest of crops like soybeans. So let's dive in now and see what we can learn about how caterpillars and other creatures, insects, overwinter. Now, again, we live on a planet that's a little bit tilted, means it gives us seasons, and we live in one of the temperate zones rather than the tropical zones. So that means we're going to have seasons, including a winter with frigid temperatures. This, I think, is perhaps the most recent hardiness map. So if we have a quick peek here, we're basically split between zone 6 and zone 7. So out in Garrett and Allegheny, it's going to be a little bit chillier than it is down here. But in the warming world, hey, it won't be long before we're zone 8. But we could go as low as something like, oh, I don't know, maybe 10 degrees, minus 10 sometimes. This year, certainly in several parts of the region, we had several days in single digits. I think in the DMV, in the district, I think we had 3 days during July and February. But if you go out to some place like Garrett County, those guys had a dozen days in these single digit temperatures. And that's going to have important implications for some of the insects that live there. Okay. Now, for living things, they're going to depend on signals from Mother Nature to adjust their life cycles to the changing seasons. The two big cues that are going to be used, of course, are photoperiod. And as we go from January to December, I think we're all familiar with this curve where it's pretty hot here in the month of July and early August, and we start to backtrack a little bit. So again, that last week in January historically has been the coldest week we've ever had. We ramp up and then we head back down. The other big uh, basically signal that insects are receiving, of course, I maybe mentioned this already, was the hours of sunlight photo period. That's this one. Same thing. And of course, both related very closely, right? Because the energy for the ambient temperatures outdoors is directly related to the impingent sunlight and the hours of warming. So again, so as we begin to tail off from the longest day of the year and the warmest time of the year into the cold period, we see dramatic changes, for example, in our deciduous plants, right? Our trees go from, in the autumnal season, from this to this inimical season we called winter when there aren't a lot of leaves. There are simply not a lot of green here. So this has some important implications for insects. When it comes to our friends, the caterpillars, of all the orders of insects, it's really the caterpillars that have the greatest proportion of all the orders of insects that are plant feeders. And like that black swallowtail in my garden, those guys can really chomp leaves, right? We've all seen this. Well, what are the implications of this with the change of seasons? For insects and mites, I think we all know that these are essentially poikilotherms or insects that rely on ambient temperatures to regulate their development, their physiologies, and their behaviors. And basically, the way this works, the colder it is, the slower the rates of development and activity are. But as temperatures warm, that goes up. And it's pretty crazy when I've worked on some of these developmental curves. For a large portion of that relationships, it's almost linear. It looks like a physics rather than a biology issue to me. But of course, there will be some lethal temperature at a higher temperature when development does stop. And finally, it becomes a lethal temperature. So I know somebody like the hickory hornedevil, in addition to the black swallowtail. So here's your hickory hornedevil. Golly, one of my favorite caterpillars of all. I had the golden opportunity about a decade ago to rear a whole bunch of these things out. Somebody had collected a pupal case underneath a walnut tree. I brought it in. The female emerged. I put her in a little cage. I put that cage outside. And the next morning there was a male. And then I had 100 eggs to raise the wonderful caterpillars from. Okay, but back on track here. Basically, the warmer it is, the faster they will develop, the more activity, right? But as we reflect back on this, they're going to suffer the same fate as our trees, which are also cold-blooded. So again, as temperatures cool, their activity levels go down. In addition to this, there are no leaves left on the trees in winter. We live primarily in an eastern hardwood forest over much of our range here in Maryland, and there are simply no leaves. So if it's cold and you can't move, and the plants you depend on don't have leaves, you better have a game plan, right? So the larvae that will overwinter, and insects will have different strategies for dealing with these dire situations. And there'll be basically, a couple or three different strategies that they'll use to deal with the fact that it's cold and there's no more food. Now, in temperate regions like Maryland, there's a strategy I call get out of town. And I think we all know the story about the monarch butterflies. For a couple of you, you said the monarch caterpillar was your favorite. So during the winter months, or the late autumn months, I should say, they're going to make this astounding migration from parts of Canada all the way down the eastern United States, from the far reaches of the Midwest down through the central part of the country to overwinter in the Oyamel fir forests in Mexico. This particular monarchs that I'm showing you in this video are actually the Western monarchs, which have a similarly interesting and fascinating migration from as far north as Canada and the Rocky Mountains back to coastal California, where they spend the winter. Okay, so that's the monarch story. One strategy, get out of town. But the monarchs are not alone in this, right? If we look at things like the variegated fritillary, those guys are also heading south. So are ones like the buckeye, some of my favorites. And of course, the painted ladies are the travelers. These guys migrate all over the world, but again, escape the cold for refuges, thermal refuges in the south. So another reality here is if you can't get out of town, what are you going to do? You're going to deal with it. Okay. One of my favorite activities this time of year when it's pretty dull otherwise is to go out and start to turn over leaves and rocks and roll over debris on the ground. And I more than often will turn up the larva of the giant leopard moth, right? They'll all often be curled up in a little ball like this. I imagine that all these spines and that red we see in the intersegmental membranes is just a warning to predators not to try to eat me when I can't move and I'm frozen underground. The star of the show, always, of course, is the banded woolly bear. Again, one of my favorites, and there's nothing more fun for me than to see those guys dashing around on the sidewalks, on the roadways in the autumn, trying to find that place, that hibernaculum where they can hang out and survive the winter. And a bad player that's going to be the new kid on the block, the one we're really going to be concerned with over the next several years. Does anybody have a guess what that particular caterpillar might be? You can put it in the chat box. Let me see if I can find the chat box again. Yeah, I've lost my chat box. But anybody know what this one is?
Neighbor moth, oakworm, they're guessing.
Nope. It
Spongy
crossed the
moth.
border. It crossed the border from Loudoun County, Virginia this year into Washington County, Maryland. It's an invasive species known as the box tree moth. To my way of thinking, this is going to be one of the most dramatic changes we see in our landscapes, particularly historical landscapes like Mount Vernon, Dunbarton Oaks, the National Arboretum, where we're now going to have to contend with a pest that moved from Asia to Europe to Canada and unfortunately was shipped with infested boxwood plants to several states here in the United States, and it now has crossed the border into Maryland. This one also is going to overwinter in the larval stage. Will the cold winter kill it? No, this one's good at negative 22 Fahrenheit. So we can't hope that the chilly winter is going to set this one back. Okay, so how do caterpillars deal with it? Let's take a look at this. To deal with the chilly winter or other adverse conditions, it could be drought, could be lack of food, there's a very, very clever evolutionary strategy that our friends, the arthropods, the insects in particular, have evolved, and this is called diapause. It's a physiological state of basically reduced metabolism, a chill down, a period of dormancy, and it's suspended development that allows them to survive, let's say, a winter when it's cold and there's no food, or perhaps in a different habitat when it's particularly dry and it's hot and there's nothing to eat. It's genetically determined. It's controlled by hormones that circulate within the hemolymph of the insect. And it's induced by changing environmental cues like the two I mentioned before. One of the primary cues is declining day length. In other words, that reduction in photoperiod that occurs after, the longest day of the year in the summertime and as it works its way through the winter solstice and finally to, a time when days are really short. But in addition to this, there are other cues that can be used. Another one, of course, is these declining temperatures that are also inducing changes in the food that these caterpillars are going to eat. And there can be other cues that are used like lack of food. So it's this suspended development that must take place for our caterpillars to survive the winters. And under normal conditions, that's exactly what's going to happen. It's called diapause development. Now, some insects will evolve behavioral changes in addition to these physiological changes associated with diapause. One is that really noxious little mosquito called the northern house mosquito. This one is crepuscular. It's also a non-native, but it's been here for a long time. What we know about the Culex mosquito as that as day length shortens, as temperatures cool, it will begin to seek refuges. Now, those refuges could be my tool shed, but the other kind of refuge that works very well is a refuge below the surface of the earth. In other words, in places like DC, in places like London and New York City, what they will do is they will move into underground parking garages. These were first discovered in London during the Blitzkrieg when people would go into the subway systems to avoid the bombs and they were being bitten by Culex mosquitoes in the wintertime. Why? Because of the great thermal mass of the planet we live on. We all know that once you go 5 or 6 feet underground, the soil temperature is well above freezing. So behaviorally, things like the Culex mosquito will go into sub-basements, they'll go into parking garages, they'll go into sewers, into storm drains, into sewer pipes behaviorally to avoid those chilling temperatures. Pretty clever. Okay, but guess what? Our caterpillars can't really drill down underground. I think, as Max is going to tell us, I sure hope so, some of these caterpillars are pretty darn clever in finding a way to kind of buffer those severe temperatures that they're going to be facing. But there is another way to get around this problem, and that's a physiological way to do it. Now, this can be classified into two major categories: to freeze or not to freeze. So to freeze means you're going to be freeze tolerant. You are actually going to physiologically prepare your body to freeze. It's quite a trick. The other way they can do this is freeze avoidance. Now, this is a way to actually to prevent your body from freezing. And again, a whole clever series of physiological changes and also behavioral changes that will allow that insect to survive sub-freezing temperatures. Okay. Now, in terms of the Lepidoptera, I kind of did a little dive into the literature because that's always a good idea, I guess. There was a wonderful study. I think I've listed some of the references at the end of this talk, perhaps, that was done in 2025. And it basically reviewed how the Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies, can tolerate the winter, cold temperatures. Okay. And what they found in a study of some 50 different kinds of Lepidoptera, both moths and butterflies, that about 71% of these are what we call the freeze avoiders, and another 29% were the guys that were freeze tolerant. So the vast majority of our caterpillars are what we call freeze avoiders. They use freeze avoidance. Now, how do they do this? Well, to understand how this goes, we're going to have to learn a little bit of terminology. All right, so try to bear with me on this. If you have any questions, please, you can break in. You can't disrupt chaos. I'll be fine. So if you have a question, please go ahead and ask. We'll try to get through some of this. There's an important biological event that happens when your body's comprised of a lot of liquid, as we are, as caterpillars are. There's a temperature at which the fluids in a body will begin to freeze. This is called the supercooling point. Now, this temperature is a temperature below what we consider freezing, 32 degrees, when water freezes, correct? It actually turns out that pure water with no solutes in it will freeze at a temperature much lower than 32 degrees. So supercooling means that it's a temperature below what we normally consider freezing, but the supercooling point is the point at which the liquids inside that animal actually do freeze. the freezing point, and it's going to be below 32. Freeze tolerance means it's the ability to survive the freezing of their body fluids during sub-zero temperatures. And by sub-zero, now we're talking about 0 centigrade or 32 Fahrenheit. Whereas the freeze avoidance means the ability to survive sub-zero temperatures by preventing their blood from freezing. Everybody good? Good so far? All right. I'm not going to go into this. This is another basically phenomenon that happens. It's called chill susceptibility. And this is an inability to survive cold temperatures above the freezing, above 32. So for example, I've already mentioned harlequin bugs. I've already mentioned things like kudzu bugs. They are simply going to freeze before it even goes below freezing. They just can't survive a chill. Okay, we're not going to deal with that, but I do want to spend some time on these other mechanisms. Now, this is a wonderful diagram that basically is going to help us understand some of the changes that take place during these two phenomena. Insect cold tolerance strategies. And again, this comes from this wonderful review article, which I've listed here below. Let's start with freeze avoidance, because I think this is going to be the most fascinating, perhaps the easiest one to understand. What's going to happen is the insect is going to prevent its liquids, its hemolymph and intracellular liquids from freezing. Extracellular ice is going to be prohibited. Okay, so we've got the cell. We've also got liquids beyond the cell, yes? Now, the reason we want to prevent that freezing, and I'll show you in a minute, is ice crystals are lethal. I want everybody to repeat after me. Ice crystals are lethal. So we're trying to prevent those ice crystals because those ice crystals can penetrate and destroy the cell membrane. They can mess up internal structures within the inside of that insect. So we're going to try to prevent that. Extracellular ice is prohibited. We're going to actually lower the supercooling point. We're going to depress the supercooling point. We're going to eliminate ice nucleating agents, and we're going to do it by accumulating cryoprotectants. Okay? And the temperature, the lower lethal temperature, is going to be very close to the supercooling point, the point that they just can't get any colder before things freeze. So let's dig into some of these terms just a little bit more. Formations of ice crystals can be lethal. So for example, if the ice crystals, if we have water that forms ice crystals out here, it can pierce and rupture that membrane, causing cell death. We can also have intracellular ice that can also damage the cell membrane and disrupt organelles. It can form near mitochondria, for example, and rupture the membranes on the organelles. Okay? The third thing that can happen is as ice crystals form, there will be a migration of water molecules out of the cell because now the concentration is lower out here. So by osmosis, water molecules will move out, causing cells to dehydrate. Okay, so these are three mechanisms or three reasons why we, if we can, we're going to try to prevent the formation of ice crystals. All right, I'm going to take a break here because the chair I'm sitting in has a defective piston, and I see my face is slowly declining, and pretty soon I'm going to disappear, and all you're going to hear is a voice. Okay, so here we go. All right, so again, extracellular ice, that's why we want to prevent it. Let's lower the supercooling point. How can we do that? How can we do that? Well, what is an ice nucleating agent? Has anybody ever heard the term ice nucleating agent? I really didn't know a lot about this. I did, however, have the experience in shortly after Thanksgiving of going up near Harper's Ferry and going snow tubing with my grandkids. Now, as I'm riding up there, it's 45 degrees. There's no snow on the ground, but yet here's this field full of snow. How do they make that snow? How do you make snow when it's never been below freezing? Here's how you make snow. Here's how you make ice crystals, okay, before it reaches 32 degrees. What you do is you get Snowmax, which is sterilized proteins of the bacterium Pseudomonas syringae. That's familiar to us. And basically, what they do is they spray it into the air, and that elevates the temperature at which ice crystals form. In other words, it allows the ice crystal to form at a temperature above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can make snow at 34 or 36 and have a place to go snow tubing. Or if you go skiing, you wonder when you go to Whitetail, how in the world do you have snow at Whitetail when it's so warm, right? Okay, that's how they do it. Now, these large proteins cause extracellular ice formation, and that's going to be really important in the next strategy to form extracellular ice. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And they protect cells from lethal ice crystal formation and intercellular freezing. So in our freeze tolerant insects, that's what they're going to do. But I just wanted to talk about what ice nucleating agents are, because as we look back at our chart, we see that these insects are eliminating them. They don't want to have any compounds in their body that would help ice to form, because they're going to try the opposite trick. They're going to prevent ice from forming. But when we look over here, we see these guys are going to produce those little compounds, those little proteins that cause ice to form. But let's stick with our program here. So the next step here is to accumulate what we call cryoprotectants. What are cryoprotectants? We all know what ethylene glycol or polypropylene glycol is. It's this molecule. Why? You put it in the radiator of your car, and now your car, the water in your car's radiator isn't going to freeze, right? That's what they do. These are cryoprotectants. Insects do the same thing. Our friend the woolly bear is going to produce these compounds. They're called sugar alcohols or polyols. As you can see, they're going to have several alcohol moieties on them. Things like glycerol, sorbitol, trehalose. All right. These are all molecules. When you put them in water, it causes the water to freeze at a much lower temperature, just like the glycerol you put in your antifreeze of your radiator of your car. The other really interesting piece of the puzzle is they can also produce proteins. These are called antifreeze proteins, and there are many kinds of these. Many of them are basically polymers of one of our amino acid called threonines. If this is sounding like organic chemistry, guys, my apology. Not my favorite subject. I was able to get through it, but it's a little bit of chemistry here, organic chemistry. And what they do is these threonine molecules basically form a web. They form like a mat. And as an ice crystal tries to form, that mat grabs onto the ice crystal and it prevents the ice from forming. Incredibly clever anti-freeze proteins. It's like Spider-Man. You know, Spider-Man spins out a web, it cloaks it, and then the bad guys can't do anything. It's the same way with these antifreeze proteins. Make this B solenoid matrix that stops crystal formation. Pretty cool. No pun intended. Okay, now what we've done is we've lowered the temperature inside that insect and basically allowed it to survive much colder temperatures, temperatures well below freezing, maybe as much as negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit below freezing. Okay, super clever. Just how did they ever do this? Bugs just amaze me all the time. All right, let's go through the freeze tolerance now. I'm not going to use a lot of illustrations. We've got all our definitions. What they're going to do is what we call a control freezing. So as temperatures begin to reduce, these insects are actually going to transport water outside of their cells. If the water is outside of the cell, it can't form a lethal crystal inside the cell. So they export water, then they create these ice nucleating agents that causes the water basically to freeze outside the cell where it can't or it doesn't damage the cell. So a totally different strategy. And now basically the insect is also going to manufacture our friends, the cryoprotectants, the same cryoprotectants we talked about before, the polyols, the the sorbitol, the trehalose, and antifreeze proteins. So now they got the water freezing outside the cell so it can't damage the inside of the cell. And we've got all these supercoolant molecules inside the cell preventing it from freezing. To freeze or not to freeze. Two very clever strategies employed by caterpillars to survive the winter temperatures. This don't get bogged down in here. This is just a different representation. You can forget all this stuff. Just ignore all this stuff up here. But what I wanted to show you is freeze tolerance can take it down to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Freeze avoidance can go from as little as simply 2 degrees, negative 2 degrees Fahrenheit, to as far as negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is going to be right around the super cooling point for those particular insects, those particular caterpillars. Okay? All right. Well, thanks for inviting me to feed about my friends, the caterpillars. And let's kill the volume on this. But basically, you know, when I saw this one, I said, oh boy, this is going to be a really different kind of winter. This one's going to be real warm. And I said, well, this one's going to be a little bit more normal. This one's probably going to be a chillier winter. Okay. And the first time I saw the giant leopard moth, which is it's entirely black, and by the old folklore, the more black there is on it, the worse the winter's going to be. I said, "Oh my God, that caterpillar is telling me that it's going to be the worst winter that ever happened. There's no orange on it at all." So with that, guys, I'm going to thank you very much for your time and attention. I'm going to turn it over to uh, my friend Max, if there are any questions.
We're going to do questions at the end, Mike, if that's okay.
Very good. Perfect. Okay, well, thanks a lot.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you, Mike. And now we're going to turn it over to Max for part 2. You can unshare and we'll get that going.
Okie dokie. Good?
Yeah.
Great.
Awesome. Thank you. Let me see if I can pull this up here. Yeah, and I'm seeing what we're going to have snow again this weekend, something like that. Yeah. I have to say I'm ready for spring. Let's see here. Great. Yeah, that was super interesting. And I really wish that review paper had come out, a couple years earlier, because that would have helped me figured all that out. That's really awesome. So yeah, so my dissertation, which I defended, I guess about a year ago, but then I presented to the Natural History Society some years earlier, so all of the data wasn't completed at that point. But now this has actually been published, so you can go read it yourself. But I'll try and give you a very short rundown of what I found. So my dissertation was the effects of fallen leaf management practices on overwintering insect communities and ecosystem function, or rather, why you should leave your leaves. So this past fall, I'm sure you started to see the leaf litter pile up on the sides of roads. You heard the roar of the leaf blowers. You saw the vacuum trucks. Well, this occurrence, and frankly, a lot of people do spring cleanup as well. So we might start seeing this, within the next couple months. I'm trying to see how I can make this hide floating. Here we go. So it turns out that about 35 million tons of yard waste are produced each year in residential yards. And that's a huge amount of material. It's about the same amount of municipal plastic waste that we produce. And that's being taken to landfills. And a lot of people have been worried about the potential harm that would cause to overwintering insects. So, we heard from Mike about the different options that insects have, and finding refuges, finding shelters, or burrowing below ground are important options. So if we remove those shelters, probably something bad is going to happen. And so this is where the idea of leave the leaves came from. We've seen these signs, and this idea has been going around for quite a while, but there hadn't been any research on the actual effects of removing leaves. So that's what my dissertation was on. And I worked with yards in the suburban Maryland area between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. And I would go to their properties and I would either remove leaves or keep them in these square meter plots. And then in the spring, I would place emergence traps on the top of those different treatments. And an emergence trap is basically just a mesh tent that is going to collect all of the insects that are emerging. So we raked the leaves or left the leaves in November, and then the following spring, we placed the emergence traps, and then we collected from them for 8 collection periods. And we did that for 2 years. But the first question is, why does any of this matter in the first place? Some of us think, this is just a yard, it's turf grass, it has no value whatsoever. And that really couldn't be further from the truth, especially in areas with really beautiful tree canopies. And we're lucky enough in Maryland to have a lot of urban and residential areas that have fairly developed tree canopies. So it turns out that in a meter square of residential yard, on average, there are almost 2,000 insects and spiders emerging. And that's just of the groups that we measured, which are this holometabolous group, these groups that pupate, and spiders. So we're not counting, any other insect, of which there are tons. So yeah, in a square meter of yard, from March until July, so not even for the entire year, 20 Lepidoptera, or moths and butterflies, are emerging, almost 300 parasitic wasps, over 100 spiders, almost 400 beetles, and over 1,000 flies. And so what happens when you remove leaves? Well, it turns out that when you remove leaves, the Lepidoptera, or the butterfly and moth abundance, is reduced by about 45%. And the average spider emergence is reduced by about 56%. And the average beetle abundance emergence is reduced by about a quarter. So we are seeing these fairly drastic decreases that were hypothesized. Flies and parasitic wasps, we didn't see any statistically significant decline, but there was less of them emerging overall. So the next question is, okay, we know their numbers are going down. Is this changing the types of insects that are emerging because we're changing their habitat? So we looked at moths and parasitoid wasps, which are two groups that are really important to gardeners. And by moths, I mean Lepidoptera. So butterflies were included in that as well. And, you know, these are pollinators, these are food sources for breeding birds. And the parasitoids are really important biocontrols, natural enemies that are going to make sure we don't have outbreaks in our garden. So they're of, you know, definite interest as ecosystem services to us as gardeners. Well, it turns out that by removing leaves, you reduce the species richness of butterflies and moths by 44%. And not only that, we saw that there were shifts in the types of species that were emerging. So we saw less leaf miners in comparison to other groups. We saw less species that have an overwintering trait of overwintering in leaves. And we saw less species that have an overwintering strategy of overwintering in the larval phase. And all of this kind of is fairly intuitive that these are the groups that we would see the greatest issues with. In terms of parasitic wasps, again, we didn't see any differences in the abundance or the emergence of parasitic wasps. We also didn't see any effects to the richness of the different families of parasitic wasps that emerged. But we did see that the types of parasitic wasps that emerged changed. So we saw less eulophid wasps and less ichneumoniid wasps, which are two wasp families, than other groups. And what's interesting is the eulophids specialize on feeding on leaf miners. And ichneumonids tend to parasitize overwintering larvae, or larvae as opposed to other stages. So we're seeing that these effects are kind of being transferred up the food chain. Just real quick, you know, a question is, does this change the quality of my soil? I mean, if I'm removing leaves, probably, right? And the answer is yes. In areas where leaves were removed, we saw significantly less soil organic carbon. So that's just kind of an aside there. But there are other strategies. It's not just remove leaves or keep leaves. A lot of people shred leaves. They'll run a lawnmower over them, for instance. And there's this new idea of actually keeping leaves, not in your entire yard, but moving them to places where they're, you know, you can keep them. This idea of having soft landings under trees, areas where insects can complete their life cycle. So we wanted to look at this as well. And we did this in a separate study where we were able to really manipulate the environment. So this was in a forested ecosystem. And here we created these plots where we removed the leaves and then we would weigh them and divide them into quarters. And one quarter we would shred, one quarter would be left bare, one quarter would be the control or the retain treatment, and we would double up, and then one quarter would be a pile treatment, kind of like those soft landings, where we would take the leaves from the remove section and move it over to the pile section. And then in the spring, again, we placed the emergence traps and we did those sequential collections. So we saw that in comparison to removing leaves, kind of the act that most residential landowners do, if you were to retain them instead, you increased the average number of Lepidoptera emerging by over 50%. And if you created a pile of leaves, that actually increased by 90%. And we also saw similar things with spiders, where we're doubling the number of emerging spiders if we retain our leaves as opposed to remove them. We didn't see any differences here for parasitic wasps, beetles, or flies. So this matches what we were seeing in the suburban study, except for beetles. In the forest, we didn't see any difference for beetles, but we did see that there was a significant difference, a decline in beetles in the residential areas. The other thing that I think is interesting is that we didn't find any difference between shredding and removal, any significant statistical difference. So shredding is not really an alternative practice if you want to preserve your insects, which makes sense because we're running a lawnmower over them. But, for other purposes, creating compost, increasing your soil quality in your lawn, that's another issue. So just to touch on what Mike was talking about, these refuges, basically they're regulating the temperature. And that was one of the hypotheses that I had, that this leaf litter would act like a blanket. And if you take that away, you're going to be exposing them to cold, but also not only to cold, but to temperature variation as a whole. So I buried temperature probes in each of the treatments, and these are measuring the temperature every hour of the day. And so this is the average soil temperature in a removal plot. And this is the average temperature in a shred plot. We're seeing the line is a little bit thinner. If you retain your leaves, if you don't touch them, we're seeing this shape. And then if you create a pile, we're seeing this shape. So what you're seeing is the soil temperature variation is a lot smaller when you keep your leaves or you pile your leaves. So the leaves are reducing that soil temperature variation. And we can even look at it like this, where we look at it over a day. So the mean daily temperature variation is about 50% less if you keep your leaves as opposed to if you remove your leaves. And that temperature variation is important to insects. The freezing and the thawing and the freezing and the thawing can reduce the fitness and or the health of these insects, especially if you think about the behavioral elements that are involved and the physiological elements that are involved with freeze tolerance or freeze avoidance. So overall, we are seeing, we finally have some scientific evidence behind these hypotheses of the negative effects of leaf removal. We know that soil temperature variation goes down or goes up when you remove your leaves. So we're losing the ability of temperature buffering. We're seeing changes to the community of insects. We're seeing a decrease in diversity in some groups. We're seeing removal of other sensitive groups. I talked a little bit about a decrease in soil organic carbon. There's also a slower rate of decomposition. And finally, we're seeing the numbers of insects are declining as well. So with that, I I always like to show this at the end because there's so much effort and outreach being put into creating habitat during the active months of the year, the summer, the spring. And those are great. Plant your native plant gardens. Um, but you also have to think about these overwintering stages because they have to go through this process. And if you only are protecting them in one part of the year and then you're killing them in the other, that's not going to be good long term. So yeah, I think that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Max, so much. So I'm going to unshare, and then I'm going to put a spotlight on both you and Mike. I'll put a spotlight on you. Okay, so now we can open it up for Q&A. You can put your questions in the chat box. You can raise your hand and I can call on you to do that. We did have, well, Grace earlier on, Mike asked about if we find the invasive caterpillars, how are we reporting them?
Yeah. Yeah, this is not a quarantine pest, gang, like Emerald ash borer was. Um, I'm not going to attempt to explain why it's not a quarantine pest here in Maryland. I haven't thought it through enough, and I haven't talked enough to the state people to know. What you should do is you should basically, if you find that, you should report it to the Maryland Department of Agriculture. No question. If you suspect you have that, you should contact the Maryland Department of Agriculture. There, we have a good fact sheet on this already at the University of Maryland Home and Garden Center has a nice fact sheet on box tree moth. I just wrote an article on this there's a arborist journal called Tree Care Industry. And in their most recent issue, it would be the February issue of Tree Care Industry magazine, I think. It was, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was February. There's an entire story about box tree moth. The problem here is this is a very rapid killer. I was at the second detection here in Maryland, up in Washington County near Clear Spring. There was a retired National Park Service scientist who collected boxwood and had more than 100 boxwoods on his property over a span of 40 years. He noticed a little bit of damage on these boxwood that could have been leaf miner, could have been volutella, any of the number of boxwood diseases. In the autumn of 2024. By September of 2025, every single boxwood was dead. Okay, totally annihilated. So this is going to be a very rapidly moving pest. The upside of this is it's going to be extraordinarily easy to control. Caterpillars, as Max knows, are rather fragile creatures, and you'll be able to use OMRI, in other words, organic products like BTs or spinosad. If indeed you were to get this on your boxwood, it would be very easy to control it. Okay, so there's going to be an element like that. I'm trying to think if I've done an episode of Bug of the Week on this, but if I have not done one recently, I surely will do one soon. And what I'll do is I'll make a quick search and see if I've already written about this sometime in the past. And Bronwyn, I'll share that with you, the link for that, so you can learn a little bit more. But this is not going to be a good situation, unfortunately. You know, people would say, well, there are lots of replacements for boxwoods. There's no question about that. And that's exactly what this fellow is going to do. He's going to plant other kinds of woody shrubs to take the place of his boxwoods. But the reality here as well is we have historic boxwood plantings at places like Mount Vernon, Dumbarton Oaks, the National Arboretum, and there will be places where people are going to want to try to protect their boxwood. So fortunately, it will be easy to manage, and we will be able to defeat this particular pest. But I'm afraid this genie is out of the bottle. It's now in 8 states and moving pretty rapidly across the eastern part of the United States. If anybody is a watershed steward, or you care to go to the watershed steward meeting, which is going to be not this Saturday, but the following Saturday in Annapolis, I will be talking about box tree moth probably for about 20 minutes and go through the life cycle, where it came from, how it got here, what it looks like, and what you can do. We'll get on top of this one, but it's one you're going to want to keep your eye out for if you have boxwoods.
All right. Calvin, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Great. Thanks so much for all the information. Great presentations. I learned a lot. I have a couple questions. I think they're mostly for Max. The first one is I talk to folks a lot about Leave the Leaves in my interpretive programs. And one question that I haven't gotten, but I'm a little bit concerned that I will get is the how Leave the Leaves impacts the presence of mosquitoes in folks' yards. That's my first question, and then I have another question that I can hold. But yeah, that's the main one for right now.
Yeah, so we didn't see many mosquitoes at all in our study. And so, it really depends on the type of leaf. Maybe if you have like huge sycamore leaves that are curling up and creating pockets of water, perhaps. But besides that, I don't think that mosquitoes are going to be a huge concern with leaving leaves. Now, having ivy and like English ivy in your yard,
Right.
or a lot of those types of evergreen ground covers, those could be probably more of an issue. Same with ticks. There have been a couple papers on people who had massive piles of leaves in their yards. And yes, in those situations, there were more ticks being found. But for just leaving your leaves as they fall, we definitely didn't see any more ticks.
Great news. And I'll mention that with the English ivy because that's another good plug for why to replace that. And then I'm also just curious, you said that there was like a 90% higher rate of survival with the soft landings, which is something I've just recently learned about, which is amazing news. I'm wondering, is there any concern about tipping the scale so much in, the great direction that the ecological, like, will there be enough resources?
Yeah, I think, I talk so much about leave the leaves, but a large part of what I do in my job is about preserving rare bees, and bees actually really like bare soil. So I think it's better to have like a mosaic. Like if you're really focused on, I want my yard to be habitat, then I would have a mosaic of different habitat types, bare ground, vegetated ground. But if you're just trying to do the bare minimum and you have a turf grass yard, I think the soft landings, I think plant an oak tree or plant a tree that we know is really supportive to beneficial insects, and then leave the leaves that fall under there and create that soft landing with the native plantings.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, remember that leaves are Mother Nature's plan. This is an ancient plan that's been worked out over eons, and leaves are supposed to fall under trees. And I think as Max said, the animals that have evolved to live there take advantage of this. This is what they know how to do, and this is fundamentally the way it's supposed to be, I think.
The one other thing I'll say is, and I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but there is a limit to. So when we said, so this addition treatment, it was a doubling of leaves, right? What we're not talking about is just a massive leaf pile that is taking all of the leaves from your yard and putting into one area. Because what that's going to do is it's going to basically just smother everything that's living under there. You're going to have less oxygen. Eventually, you might even start a compost pile. So, and if that's what you mean by like, is there a top limit? Then yes, I definitely wouldn't create leaf piles that are like more than, I don't know, 6 inches or so.
Okay, that's good to know. Adrian was interested in that last slide, one of the last slides you did, Mike, with the strategies. The tolerance and avoidance, is one more successful than the other? You know that one went lower and one didn't, but is there a success rate?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the only way I think I can answer this question is across that broad survey that those scientists did, what they found was, 71% were avoiders and 29% were basically tolerers. So that's the only evidence I could weigh to suggest that anyway, for that collection of Lepidoptera that they were able to get data for, it simply is leaning in the direction of a freeze avoidance strategy rather than a freeze tolerant strategy. So in a measure of success, I think we have to try to assess it that way than basically within a species, because these are evolutionary traits we're seeing, evolutionary behaviors and physiologies that have basically taken place over tens of millions of years. So I don't know how else to assess it than that, but I'm going to go with freeze avoidance as maybe seems to be a slightly, they're both winning strategies, but that one is a little bit more common.
That's the one that I use. I avoid being frozen. Stella is asking about the reference data that you had for the square meter of ground, Max. So the number of insects that come out, what was the reference square meter of ground? Was that in Maryland? Was it in the Midwest? Was it in a forest?
Yeah, that was based on our experiments. So we're talking about areas where leaves are left in residential central suburban Maryland.
All right, and Preston comes in with, does the frozen water affect the caterpillars when it freezes?
Does the frozen water on the extracellular water? So that's the whole strategy. In the freeze tolerant, what they're doing is they're actually letting water molecules get out of the cell. By doing this, you're increasing the solute concentration inside the cell. You're also making it so any ice crystals that do form outside the cell and don't pierce. They also have other adaptations to their cells and structures that I'm not going to get into, but basically you're making all the water happen out here instead of inside here where it can damage organelles. And because you're producing, in addition to letting water freeze out here with the ice nucleating proteins, inside you've got your antifreeze proteins, and you've also got your other cryoprotectants like your trehalose and things like this that are preventing the internal liquids in those cells from freezing. So again, it's a bizarre but clever strategy to get rid of some water, let your ice out. In fact, actually let ice form at a higher temperature. Remember, the ice nucleating proteins, instead of water freezing at 32, it's now freezing out here at something like 34, 36. So now you've actually basically dramatically lowered your supercooling point by the combination, and you've avoided the formation of those potentially lethal ice crystals inside your cells. So
I meant like when it expands when it freezes.
yes, it does. No question about that. Yeah, it does. I don't know. I didn't, as I read these papers, I didn't come across any particular reference about a change in volume associated with water freezing. So I don't know how, I frankly just don't know how that would play into it, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, when water freezes, it expands. Thank goodness, because if it didn't, all the ice at the polar ice caps would be at the bottom of the sea.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right,
You're welcome.
thank you. So then we have, did Alan have his hand up? Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
Hi, I've got my standard question because I'm always interested in the humans that come here. But also just, I know it doesn't work the same way, but what you just were describing, it reminds me of when I'm wearing a wetsuit, a little bit of, but it's not, I know it's not the same type of function, but anyway, but what I like to ask the humans in the room is, as far back as you want to go chronologically, share how you got interested in this area, is specifically with caterpillars or just in general, as far back as you want to go into childhood. I'm always interested to find out what the source of the interest and the passion is, because I love the interest and the passion that you guys bring.
I guess I'll go first. I was into plants first. I was really into plants as a kid. And then I started focusing on the things that were eating the plants. And I think that that's what initially triggered my interest. But I originally wanted to be a natural heritage botanist. That was my goal. So, but things change, and then I became interested in insects. But yeah, this was always a dream of mine. So I'm very lucky.
Well, the other thing I'll share with you about Max is when I had the good fortune of talking to Max before he, much to our blessing, decided to come to Maryland to do his graduate studies. And he just told me that he loved nature and was always interested in it. And he showed the passion that you've seen tonight. So I think that's pretty clear. For me, it was maybe a little easier. I'm a middle child of five, which might be apparent. And as a youngster, my mother gave me the best advice I ever heard. She said, "Go outside and play." Now, I grew up in a very rural part of New Jersey. There were fields and farms and rivers to swim in and trees to climb and things like this. And the only restriction we had was when the fire whistle blew, wherever we were, it was time to come home for dinner. I finally realized that my two older siblings were just annoying. My two younger siblings were constantly bickering and fighting. So her admonition for me to go outside and play was just a way to get me out of the house. So there was one less troublemaker in there. But it worked very much to my advantage. And I've always had a great interest in science, but particularly natural history, because I think these insects are aliens from another dimension, with the crazy and wild things they're able to do, and there's just an endless array of interesting and fascinating things to be discovered and things to enjoy. So how can you go wrong with bugs?
Well, Michael, I'm glad you didn't run with the bad boys as a kid when your mom was telling you.
Well, there was, I won't go into that. I tell you, I worked with two felons growing up in New Jersey, but that's another story. That's a story for another time.
We're already elected. No.
um, so Karen asks, when the municipalities pile up the residential collected leaves in the huge piles for composting, are they increasing mosquitoes?
Sorry?
The municipalities piling up residential collected leaves in huge piles. I guess they are they increasing mosquitoes, or
Oh,
are they?
mosquitoes. I wouldn't say so. But one of the issues with these huge piles on the sides of the roads is the runoff pollution, actually. So there's a lot of studies that look at the nutrient pollution that is created um, by just things falling on our streets or being placed there. I think phosphorus in particular from leaves is a huge water quality concern. So in some places they say bag your leaves, but I would offer instead leave them on your property where that nutrients can be, re um, cycled back into the ecosystem instead of put on pavement.
So thank you. Mike, Karen is interested in the ticks. Will the cold keep the ticks down for next year? For this?
Okay, I'm busy typing this one, but rather than type more, I'll just talk directly. The kind of winter that is bad for ticks is a very dry, cold winter, and it's tough on ticks for two reasons. Number one, ticks need water, so when it's very dry in the winter time, they are going to dehydrate. All right, so they're pretty cold tolerant. So it's not so much the cold as it is the dry and cold will be lethal. The other piece of the puzzle, of course, when we have very severe cold, dry winters, the small mammals, the things like chipmunks and white-footed mice that are the alternate host for your tick and the reservoir for your Lyme disease, their survival goes down. So now you will follow with declining survival of the ticks that depend on those small mammals. Having said that, even though we had some pretty darn chilly weather, no question about that, we had snow cover. And as Max has said, it can be leaves, but it can also be snow cover is an important thermal refuge for against a very cold, basically air temperature. And again, it will allow the warmth of the soil and the underlying layers to be trapped down below there and keep that surface layer where ticks are going to be overwintering a little bit warmer. So as much as I would like this winter to have killed all the ticks, unfortunately, I don't think that's going to be the case. The only piece of the puzzle, again, I think many of you that have been around, and I see some folks that look like me in the audience tonight, we know that, 40 years ago, the tick we worried about and was most common was the black-legged tick, vector of Lyme disease. The most common tick we get now is actually the Lone Star tick, which is a southern tick. Its range has expanded dramatically due to the prolonged period of milder winters. Okay, so a cold winter like this, maybe, but this snow cover we had before the real cold came, I think really gave those guys a chance to escape the frigid cold. So, but there's no question that southern ticks are moving further north. There's no question about that either. But again, our winters are just going to be longer. Excuse me, our winters are going to be shorter than they were 40 years ago. That's just a reality. Did that answer your question? So I guess the short answer, I wish it was, but I don't think this cold we've had is going to put a dent in the ticks we see next year.
Oh, another
Yeah.
reason why not snow. I have a question myself for Max. There are two studies. The first one was on the residential, and the second study sites were in the forested area with the quads. is the difference in the data with the emergence of the insects, does it have anything to do with, are there, I'm putting in air quotes, seed banks of insects kind of in a forested situation rather than in a kind of more suburban ecological desert situation? And could that have played into the difference in data?
Yeah, that is exactly what we think. So that's really cool that you picked up on that. So the real reason this was done in a forested experiment is because we were looking at the difference in tree canopy diversity. So we have a site out at Cirque actually where there are plots of monocultures and plots of polycultures, or like stands of trees in polycultures and monocultures. And I didn't present that data today just because it's fairly complex. But what we are seeing is that, or what we think is that the matrix of habitat types is different in a forested versus a suburban area. And that definitely plays a role in the different types of species and effects that we're seeing. Absolutely.
Are you in your new capacity, or is there anybody in the lab at University of Maryland continuing on your research and moving it in a different direction?
I don't know. That's a good question. We have to figure out what to do with all of the insects. That's the one. They're still in the lab. I'm definitely interested in people continuing along this path, really focusing on overwintering. I also think, although these broad ecological studies are valuable, having species-based experiments and studies can be really valuable as well. One, we can learn more about the actual physiology by using, a study species like the tobacco hornworm or something that is a model organism. But on the other hand, doing studies on some of our rare species that we're trying to conserve are really valuable. There were some studies, I think, out of Georgetown about the Baltimore checker spot and how it overwinters. There's a lot of species, just doing the work that I do that we need to know more about. And really the only way to do that is by working with universities. So I definitely hope more people are focused on the overwintering stage.
Well, if you're looking for a place to where your insects have to go, are these collections? Because I happen to know a place.
Well, these are the question. Whenever you're doing data work, it's like, okay, when can I get rid of, my bulk samples? When is this data sufficient? So we'll see. There might be some work actually that will be done on carabid beetles. I think that's the one potential place that this could happen, but that just depends on what future graduate students are interested in.
Right, but if you're looking for a place then for your collection to come, we'll take it in, Max. Okay.
Okay.
Take care.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions did I miss? Okay, well, we got one. If the goal is to increase pollinators and I live in a rural suburban area, I want to preserve both lawn and the woods, what is the approach for the leaves? And I think that you mentioned that before. You want a mosaic. You want a little bit of everything.
Exactly.
For that. And the leaves have to be, they can pile, but not too big, not too small, just the right amount.
If you have lawn and woods, then you're doing better than a lot of residential homes. So let the leaves fall on your woods. And the visible, maybe forward-facing part of your home, you can make look neat. Or you can even leave your leaves in your front yard, but rake a strip so it looks like it's it looks more purposeful and formal. That's another strategy as well. Or move them into your garden beds. These are all solutions. It's not black and white.
Just don't get rid of them all. And all right. So any other questions tonight for either Michael or Matt? Did I get everybody? Evergreens. Do dropped needles provide the same habitat abilities for insects and other arthropods?
So most of our homes were broadleaf fallen leaves, but absolutely, the pine needles can create definitely a nice blanket that that can warm the and protect the species overwintering below it.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Raupp and Dr. Ferlauto, for being here and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us this evening. This has been a really, really special Must Learn Thursday, and we'll have to do it again because y'all make a great tag team. So we have a wonderful time with you. Hope to see you at the museum or maybe go out into the field with y'all as well on a field trip. And for everybody else, thanks for coming in. Stay well, stay curious, leave the leaves, and we won't see you next week, but we'll see you the week after that for bird ability, so that we're learning how we can make spaces more accessible for everybody to bird, which should be fascinating.
One quick thing before we go, I have put the link into my episode of Bug of the Week that talks about the box tree moth, how to recognize it, what you should do if you find it, and ways that we might manage it. So that's in the chat right now. If you click on it, it'll take you to an episode that shows you what it looks like and the damage it causes.
And Mike, I think I will actually be at that conference too, that watershed conference.
Oh, good. I'll be looking forward to seeing you there, man.
Yeah.
Good.
It looks like we're doing a lot of things together. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's how it is. But it's great to have you on board, and really love the work you've done. It's a very important contribution, Max. So well done.
Definitely looking forward to catch up more.
That'll be great.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Have a good one.
Good night, everybody. Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Night.